Okay, today I have for you World War II Oversimplified Part 2. I've already done Part 1, so please check that one out first, or after, wherever. But please check that one out, and let's dive right into this one.
This video was made possible by Skillshare, an online learning community. Stick around until the end of the video to learn how you can get an exclusive deal just for Oversimplified viewers. So what else is happening? Well, when I said Britain was all alone, that wasn't entirely true. Many Commonwealth nations and other allied colonies had joined the war in Britain's support. They would play a key role throughout the war, particularly in the African and Italian campaigns. On the Axis side, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the defensive tripartite pact, bringing their military alliance even closer together. The Soviet Union's war against Finland should have been an easy victory, but it became a humiliating struggle, and their military ineptitude was put on full display. In the end, they did force the Finns to sue for peace. Then, they continued their honorable campaign of pushing around much smaller countries by annexing the Baltic states and part of northern Romania. France's colonies in equatorial Africa were like, heck no, we aren't going to join the Germans, and they all pledged their allegiance to free France, except for Gabon, which had to be taken by military force. The Allies also tried to capture the strategic port of Dakar, but that ended in failure. Mussolini had seen Hitler's successes, and he thought now it was Italy's time to shine, so he tried to take British Somaliland, and that went pretty well. Then he tried to take Egypt, and that went less well. Then he tried to take Greece, and that went really badly. Churchill began referring to Italy as Europe's soft underbelly.
Not wrong.
He began favoring a military campaign from the south and started sending British troops to Greece. All of this had Hitler pretty concerned, and he moved to protect his southern flank. He had been getting friendly with Hungary and twisted their arm into signing the Tripartite Pact and joining the Axis powers. Romania was also eager to join for protection against the Soviet Union. The Tripartite Pact was designed to prevent any other countries from deciding to join the Allies, specifically Britain's old ally, the pesky United States of America. When war first broke out, American public opinion was strongly against joining in. In 1940, there was an election. The Republican candidate said, "I will not send any young Americans to die in Europe," and sitting President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "I will also not send any young Americans to die in Europe. Unless I have to, then I might." And Roosevelt won. Churchill asked him to join the war, but Roosevelt said, "No can do, Winston, but you know what? Here, have some weapons." America began supplying the Allies with food and munitions, but there was one problem. German U-boats were sinking thousands of Allied supply ships in the Atlantic, including American ones. If the Germans could sever Britain's supply line, the UK would starve. Throughout the war, the Allies had to come up with better technology to fight the U-boats. Improved radar, aircraft with longer range, better weaponry and convoy tactics. At one point, a man even called a meeting and said, "Pykrete, you take some wood, you take some ice, you put them together, you get pykrete." And then he pulled out a gun and shot some wood and it shattered. And then he shot some pykrete and the bullet ricocheted off it and hit someone else in the conference room. Then they tried to make a pykrete aircraft carrier, but that idea was scrapped because that's a really dumb idea. In the end, Alan Turing and his team of codebreakers cracked Germany's Enigma code, and the U-boats gradually became less and less of a threat. Back in Africa, Britain decided to push Italy out of Egypt. Hey, that was pretty easy, so they kept going. Hitler realized he was going to have to finally step in and do something. He went to Bulgaria and Yugoslavia and said, "Hey, I'm going to move troops through you to get to Greece, so either join us or, be invaded." Bulgaria opted to join them. Yugoslavia opted to be invaded. Then Greece finally fell to the joint German-Italian invasion. The British had moved troops from North Africa to fight in Greece, which helped Rommel and his tank divisions push the British back to Egypt, and they could have kept going, but a small, mostly Australian force held out under siege for 8 months in Tobruk, denying the Germans a strategic port city and disrupting their supply line. Despite having some success in the Middle East, the British didn't seem like any real threat for now. Hey, Soviet Union, look out! With 3 million troops, Hitler launched the largest ground invasion in history, and Stalin was far from ready. Both Churchill and Roosevelt had warned him of an impending attack, but he dug his head in the sand and the Soviets didn't stand a chance. Germany made staggering progress, with huge encircling movements capturing mind-boggling numbers of Russian troops. 250,000 at Bialystok, Minsk, 300,000 at Smolensk, nearly 700,000 at Kiev, and again at Vyazma and Bryansk. Leningrad was put under a siege that would last an insufferable 4 years. The invasion of Russia had been Hitler's main ideological goal from the beginning, and his hatred for the ethnic peoples there was now unleashed in all its fury. The Eastern Front of the Second World War was brutal for all that endured it. The Germans were now inside of Moscow, and that's it. It's all over. But then it happened. It got cold. Stupid cold. Hitler had hoped the Soviets would give up before.
Guys, it gets cold in Russia. Why does nobody ever learn this? It gets very cold in Russia. Stop it. Bring winter clothes. Dress warm. Remember what your mom said when you went outside in the winter? Bring extra gloves. Want some hot cocoa? You dress nice and snug? She was talking about invading Russia, okay?
For winter, but they kept fighting. His commanders came to him and said, "Can we please dig in for the winter and wait until spring?" "No, keep going." "But oil is literally freezing inside our vehicles." "That's fine, keep going." "We're having to leave the corpses of our frozen horses by the side of the road so we can still find our way in the snowdrift." "Perfectly normal, keep going." Hitler hadn't given his millions of men winter clothing and supplies because he thought he really should have won by now. Then, Stalin called in troops from the Siberian front, specially trained to fight in the extreme cold, and the Germans were no match. They were now...
Okay, just real quick about this, that he's probably not going to mention, I really want to mention it, is that Stalin was very paranoid, which in itself is a sentence, but he was very paranoid that the Japanese are going to attack him from the other side. Once Hitler attacked, they were going to come from the other side, so he had a lot of troops over in Siberia. But he had spies in Japan that assured him that that was not the case. They absolutely assured him, and it's very, very hard to assure Stalin of pretty much anything except that people are out to get him. So they assured him. The thing I've always wondered, maybe somebody knows this? Because I've certainly researched it and not really found anything. How did Stalin, how do Russians have spies in Japan? Well, Japan's a very open, welcoming country. You know, sympathizers, probably, yeah. Sympathizers with the government, but to have the massive spy network that he had, I don't know. I don't really fully understand it. I definitely understand sympathizers, communist sympathizers within the government being spies for the Soviet Union. That makes sense. But to this number? These numbers? I guess that's the case, but it was just found a little strange.
Now being pushed back, they had no choice but to dig in and wait for winter to end. Germany's victories were staggering, and Japan was eager not to miss the victory bus. Their war in China had come to a standstill, but they wanted to keep expanding their sphere of influence and getting those sweet, sweet raw materials. They began making plans to expand southward, but there was a problem. Southeast Asia was heavily colonized by America and Great Britain. It was also full of ocean. Ocean meant naval combat, and there was no way the Japanese Navy could stand up to the US and the UK. So they thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could destroy their navies before we begin our conquest? And so it was. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise air raid on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and inflicted a huge amount of damage. They also attacked British colonies in Southeast Asia. Roosevelt had no choice but to declare war on Japan, and so did Churchill. Hitler then declared war on America, even though he totally didn't have to. The attack on Pearl Harbor seemed like a big Japanese victory, but they didn't attack any of the naval repair yards, fuel storage tanks, or the submarine base, meaning the Pacific Fleet would be up and running again pretty soon. In the meantime, though, the Japanese were able to begin...
The other thing about that, though, is they did plan to destroy those things. They did plan it, they just didn't. So what happened was that they sent in, I believe there were supposed to be 5 waves of attacks. I think it was 5, and they sent in 3. Because the 2 American aircraft carriers that were supposed to be there weren't. Now, they were stationed, I believe, San Francisco at the time. But the Japanese intelligence said they were supposed to be at Pearl Harbor. And this is why they chose this time to attack, because they felt like they could take out most of the battleships, most of the cruisers, and its 2 major aircraft carriers all in one blow, as well as destroying its biggest base. So they supposed to go with 5 waves of attacks, and the later waves are supposed to destroy the infrastructure of the base, the oil and repair facilities and all of that. But the admiral in charge, who I can't remember the name of, but he was paranoid that the Americans knew that the attack was coming, that they were playing sitting duck, and that they really had their aircraft carriers with a small fleet out hunting him and his fleet, and that they were going to attack at any time. So he called the attack short, and after 3 waves, and just left, leaving a lot of things not destroyed. And the ability for America to recover from Pearl Harbor much easier. Had they gone through the 5 attacks, Pearl Harbor would have been pretty devastated throughout the war. Americans still would have won, but it would have been a little more challenging for them.
begin their conquest. They took Guam, the Gilbert Islands, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. They forced Thailand to join them so they could march their troops through to Malaya. They swept through Singapore, North Borneo, the East Indies, New Guinea, the Solomons, and they were now threatening northern Australia and the borders of India. Japan's victory had been as staggering as the Germans, and it reinforced the Japanese idea that this was a divine war which they were destined to win. But their victories had been based on speed, not power, and power would eventually catch up with them. For now though, in all occupied nations, the people suffered. Persecution, forced labor, harsh punishments for any who spoke out against their occupiers. In Europe, the Nazis were rounding up ethnic minorities and other unwanted groups and individuals. In particular, millions of Jewish people would suffer through the terrible events of the Holocaust. Brave resistance movements rose up in defiance of their invaders, while the people held out for hope. And hope was coming. Winter was over, and Hitler could continue his push eastward. But this time, he switched up his strategy. He wanted to focus on the south. His plan was to cut off the Russian armies in the Caucasus, an area full of oil, and then invade the Caucasus and take all the oil. His forces moved across the north with ease, and Hitler got cocky. He rerouted the 4th Panzer Army south early, leaving the 6th Army to complete the encircling movement alone. To do so, the 6th Army had to reach and take the key Soviet city of Stalingrad. The Russians defended it fiercely, and Stalingrad saw some of the harshest fighting of the entire war. The Soviets held up the German advance for 5 months as they battled in the war-torn city, which bought them valuable time. When the Germans had first launched their invasion a year earlier, the Soviets had moved their factories to the east. Those factories had been building a butt-ton of tanks and aircraft and getting the Soviet army up to scratch. Now, it was ready. Stalin gathered his new and improved forces around the city, and in an attack that...
Yes, where Stalin was very unprepared for the war, he did spend a lot of time, since actually the late 20s, I believe, he was actually building the industry up for the Soviet Union, and was able to convert it to a military industry pretty quickly. So that was one thing that he did do right, even though he wasn't ready for the invasion, completely caught off guard, and his military was far from ready to fight a major war. He did have the industry to do it. So when it came down to having to get his army together and fight back, he really just needed a little bit of time. And the winter gave him that time to do it.
That resembled Hitler's own encirclement tactics, they began surrounding the 6th Army. Hitler's commanders came to him and said, "Hey, maybe we should retreat." But Hitler said, No, you stay. The entire 6th Army was trapped and had to surrender. With complete air superiority, the Soviets started pushing westward. For Stalin, it was a resounding victory. For Hitler, an absolute catastrophe. Things also weren't looking too good for Hitler elsewhere. With America now in the war, Allied bombing over German cities reached devastating levels. In Africa, the British had pushed Rommel back again. Then they were pushed back again, and finally, after a decisive battle at El Alamein, and with American and British troops arriving in the west, the Germans and Italians were squeezed out of Africa. Japan was also already seeing its rapid success being turned around. They attempted to take the island of Midway, but the US Navy was ready for the attack, and they sank Japan's carrier. Actually, they sank a lot of them. It was a battle from which the Japanese Navy would never recover. British, Indian, and Chinese troops held the line in the harsh jungle terrain of Burma, and the Japanese suffered losses in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. They began to realize they were not invincible. With the Axis out of Africa, the Allies had to decide their next move. Churchill still wanted to attack from the south, while the Americans preferred a full sea invasion in northern France. "Alright," said the Americans, "we'll do it your way." Allied forces successfully landed in Sicily and began moving north. They also carried out bombing raids over Rome. The thing was, many of the people in Sicily had relatives living in America, and they greeted the American troops quite warmly. With the war reaching home territory, most Italians just weren't that into it, and Mussolini was suddenly very unpopular. He was voted out by his own fascist Grand Council and was toppled from power. Italy immediately began negotiations for surrender. Hitler wasn't surprised and had already sent reinforcements southward. In an operation he ironically called Operation Axis, German troops quickly disarmed Italian troops in the north. The Allies continued fighting the Germans up through Italy, but then winter set in, meaning mud, and everything slowed to a halt. "Alright," said the Americans, "let's do it our way as well." Germany had made itself a lot of enemies, and millions of Allied troops had been gathering in England as factories worked around the clock producing the war material needed for a super crazy massive the likes of which the world has never seen before invasion of Europe. The Germans knew an Allied invasion would come, but they didn't know where it would land. Thanks to Allied deception tactics, they thought there was a pretty good chance it would come at Calais, but the Allies were really going to land in Normandy because it was less fortified and the beaches were nicer. Under the careful planning of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion that had been long in the making was just about ready to go. Just one thing was preventing the launch: the British weather. For a short while, everyone sat around waiting for a decent day, and then It came. On the night of June 5th, over 1,000 bombers took off and raided coastline defenses, while paratroopers were dropped inland in a bit of a chaotic operation, tasked with sabotaging defenses and capturing key bridges to stop any German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Early the next morning, the barrage came, as Allied ships fired a huge number of shells at the German fortifications, and then the landings. The Americans at Utah and Omaha, the British at Golden Sword, and the Canadians at Juneau. It was a tremendous struggle with a great loss of life, particularly at Omaha, but the Allied troops captured the beaches and the landings were a success. Then they began their movements inland. They took the port of Cherbourg and the city of Caen. The Americans moved south to capture Brittany. Then, in a massive disaster for the Germans, British and Canadian troops from the north and Americans from the south trapped the German 7th Army in a near wipeout encircling movement. In August, Allied troops landed in the south of France to little resistance. On one beach, all they found was a Frenchman handing out champagne. Paris was liberated and the Germans were pushed out of France as the Allies entered Belgium.
Sounds like France.
In the Far East, the Allies started to push the Japanese out of Burma, as the Americans launched a two-pronged offensive in the Pacific. In the south, General MacArthur led the push to liberate the Philippines, while General Nimitz oversaw the brutal island-hopping campaign. American forces had to make hard-fought landing after hard-fought landing on fiercely defended small islands as they moved steadily towards the Japanese mainland. The Japanese believed that the greatest thing a person could do was to die in battle, and the most dishonorable act was to surrender. As a result, they fought ferociously to the very end, and the closer the Americans got to the mainland, the more ferocious the resistance became. In February 1945, the Americans captured the island of Iwo Jima, and an intense firebombing campaign of Japan's wooden cities began. The Allies suffered some setbacks trying to liberate the Netherlands, but they were making progress and were now threatening the industrial heartland of Germany. Hitler's health, both mentally and physically, was rapidly deteriorating. Things were looking bad, and he was desperate. He said, "We need to turn this thing around, and I have just the trick. Remember a few years back when we blitzkrieged through the Ardennes and trapped the Allied forces in Belgium? Well, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Again." He gathered his forces and tried to pound them through the Ardennes. He used up the remainder of Germany's strength and resources, and he managed to create quite a nice bulge. He also trapped some American forces in the Belgian town of Bastogne. The Germans sent the trapped Americans a message saying surrender or be annihilated. When it was read out to the commanding officer, he said, "They want to surrender? No, sir, they want us to surrender." Nuts! And that's what they sent off as their official reply. General Patton's Third Army then managed to break the siege from the southwest, and the Germans were pushed back. Hitler's last-ditch attempt had failed, and what followed was a total collapse of the German forces. The Allies pushed into Germany from both sides. The Soviet Union took Warsaw and kept pushing to Berlin. In his bunker, Hitler realized all hope was lost. Berlin fell, and with it, Hitler's dreams of a great German empire. Two of the Axis nations had been knocked out. One to go. The Americans began their assault on Okinawa, the last island before they would reach the Japanese mainland. The desperate Japanese fought hard, launching kamikaze attacks on the US ships. The citizens of Okinawa suffered through the terrible fighting, but in 2 months, the island was captured. The Allies now had to make a choice. Either continue the devastating struggle up the Japanese mainland, or they could try to coerce the Japanese into surrendering now. In July, the first successful atomic bomb test took place in New Mexico, and the destructive weapon was ready for use. America and the UK were also seeing the Soviet Union not so much liberating as occupying its captured territories, and so they wanted to put on a show of force. On August 6th, the A-bomb fell on Hiroshima. Then, on the 9th, Nagasaki. The cities were reduced to rubble, and for the people living there, it was a terrible fate. But for the Allies, it achieved their main aim. In September, the Emperor announced Japan's surrender, saying the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. After 6 years, war was finally over. The Allies occupied Japan for 8 years. The Emperor was allowed to keep his position, but General MacArthur made sure this picture was printed in the Japanese press, to display to the Japanese people that their Emperor was not the divine, powerful being they had believed. Germany was divided between America, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union. In 1949, the Allied sectors were united into West Germany. The Second World War had been more terrible and destructive than the First. In its aftermath, two major superpowers with two very different ideologies had come out victorious, and the tension between the two of them would create a new kind of war. A very, very cold one. Wow, Churchill, that looks just like me. And your app is doing...
Yeah, so, these videos are really interesting, but they're definitely oversimplified. There's a lot of really good points to be made here. The thing with the Japanese is that their cities were not built to the same degree that the European cities were. They didn't use a lot of stone or brick. A lot of them were made out of wood. And the US was using firebombing campaigns for a good part of the war. As soon as they were able to get their planes into range, and after Midway and a few other major battles, the Japanese did not have the naval power to stop them. So the U.S. could move in with some carriers, hit them with some light bombers, and then move back out. But they've been bombing a lot of these cities for a long time, and when they're made out of mostly wood, firebombing works very well. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were chosen as points for atomic bombs, not because of any strategic value, but because they had not been bombed into oblivion yet. So they gave a really good demonstration of how powerful these weapons really were. They demonstrated to the Japanese, they demonstrated to the Soviets, they really demonstrated to the world how powerful these weapons were. And even though, again, these buildings were made out of mostly wood and never stood a chance against even conventional bombs, the imagery of just a city being flattened like that was shocking. It was absolutely shocking in that the few buildings that were made out of stone or brick were only partially standing at best. So these weapons were absolutely super powerful, and that's why those places were chosen, because they were trying to intimidate the Soviets a bit, but they're really trying to get the Japanese to just, it's over. Like, we have you, it's over. Don't make us invade. But I like the comment about the soft underbelly and Mussolini being kicked out of his own party that he created. Yeah, Mussolini, he never really got the Italian people totally behind him. And whereas, in America there were a lot of Germans and a lot of Italians, and both of which were serving in the military, but Hitler had reached out to the American Germans and had called for a lot of them to return back to the homeland, and many of them did. And those who didn't still felt a connection to the homeland, whereas Mussolini never did anything like that. If you were in America, you were an American, that was it. You weren't Italian anymore. So yeah, and there were probably more Italians in the American army than there were Germans, because of the fact that a lot of Italians lived in urban areas, and it was primarily urban areas that were getting a lot of recruitment in certain parts of the country. Whereas a lot of the German Americans lived in smaller towns and things, which saw a lot less recruitment, just on the basis of them requiring men for other things. Where in cities too, that Italians didn't always live in the best of cities, because Italians were still sort of, there's still a lot of prejudice against them. So they never lived in the nice parts of the cities, they always lived in the bad parts. And this was a way to get out of that. So many of them joined for that reason. So when they go and they invade Italy, it's like you're invading the homeland, and like, hey, you're Italian, we're Italian, we don't like this Mussolini guy, let's get rid of him, and let's all eat pasta. Sounds pretty good right now. But it was, yeah, so Mussolini never galvanized anyone behind him the same way Hitler did. Hitler had, he had Goebbels and everything, who was just amazing at indoctrinating people, amazing at propaganda. Mussolini never had any of that. He never really had a chance. His army didn't really want to fight. We're never fighting Ethiopia, we're never fighting easy countries. Yeah, when they're winning, everything's going right. When they're losing, they were sore losers, and they got really just, we don't want to do this anymore. Whereas Germany was like, we lost, well, we have to avenge this loss. It was like, we lost, why are we doing this? Why are we even doing this? They just weren't seeing the benefit of what they're doing. So that's why they're sort of the weak underbelly. That, and because, and the choice to divide up France into Vichy France and the occupied France was a bit of a mistake, because the Germans were focusing on the rest of the coast, but not the Mediterranean coast. So yeah, when they entered, there was very little resistance. The Germans just weren't there, really. They weren't protecting that part, and Vichy France didn't really have much of a military, being a puppet state. So there was really nobody to meet the Allies when they had gone there. Nobody to stop them. But yeah, so it really was a soft underbelly of Europe, and I do like that they have it as a burn towards Mussolini, and it kind of is. But even the Germans were at fault for that too. You know, dividing up France the way they had done it. They had also fortified the Mediterranean coast, which they should have started doing when things started going bad in Africa. They should have started doing it. And the thing is too, what really gets me, and this is just shows how bad Hitler was at decision making and how overconfident he became, is that once Italy had been invaded, you would have thought that they would have secured southern France, but they never did. So not only had you lost North Africa, and then Italy had been invaded, and then you had tried to stop them, and they still pushed you halfway up the country, and you didn't fortify southern France at all. What's wrong with this? Like, it was, I'm part of those Hitler's forces were spread very thin. The Eastern Front was eating up troops like crazy. His manpower was just diminishing, and he was expecting an attack from the north, which came, and he was more prepared for that. But he just never took any effort for the southern France. Never really took much effort to protect it, and so yeah, it was definitely soft in the belly, which is kind of funny, but just the way they make it into a burn against Mussolini. But it's easy to attack Mussolini. Oh, Benito. He is not the most successful person, but he is entertaining to watch. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and end the video there. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. I will be doing the rest of the Napoleon series very soon from Epic History TV. So I'll be doing more of those. I have some other videos planned, but if you have any other videos you'd like me to check out, please put them in the comment section and I will check them out. And I will see you next time.